When the subject of adoption came up when I was growing up, my mother's response was always the same: I love you as much as if you were my own. And I truly believe that she believed that. I know I believed it until the day I stood in the delivery room and I cut the umbilical cord of my firstborn son and held him in my arms. At that moment, I realized that my mother had lied. Not out of malice or intention, but out of ignorance. She did not know what it was to hold flesh of one's flesh and blood of one and bone of one's bones. In that moment, all of that adoption stuff got called into question. And it was a real crisis because I realized this was different. For all of my life, I had treated that adoption as no different. My cousins, my brother, my mother, my father, my aunts, my uncles were really aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, cousins, etc. As well as all of those so-called aunts, cousins, brothers, mothers, fathers, sisters that I adopted along the way. But now I realized it wasn't the same. Those relationships were different. If push came to shove, I could walk away. I could unfriend. I could block. But this was forever. I knew in that moment that no matter what happened between the two of us, he would always be my son. And there was nothing I could do about it, even if I wanted to. Not only was it a personal crisis, but it was a theological crisis for me, because adoption was the language that I used to talk about baptism. It's straight out of St. Paul, particularly in his letter to the Ephesians. That wonderful language of being adopted by God in baptism as inheritors of the kingdom. In baptism, I was adopted by God to be a child of God. That's how I always understood things. But now, how did that compare to flesh and blood? And I've spent many years wrestling with that. Until one day I realized that we are indeed flesh and blood of the Divine One. In that moment of our first breath, when we exit our mother's wombs for the first time, and we gasp for that breath of life, it is God's breath that enters us. In that moment of creation, in that moment of breath, God enters into us and all humanity. We are indeed born of God. And what baptism then becomes is a public declaration of who we are. It is a recognition of what God has already done in our birth, in our gift of life, that we say we are indeed children of God. And to reinforce that, we gather week after week at the table to be reminded of that baptismal identity as we come before Christ to receive Christ, God in flesh and blood. It is how God continues to feed and nourish us with God's presence. In body and blood, in water and spirit, we are children of God. And that's an important piece to remember, particularly in times like these, where chaos and confusion reign, where divisiveness and animosity and violence are the name of the game. In God, in our basic humanity, we are all children of God. Regardless of our political affiliations, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our gender orientation, regardless of our religion, regardless of our nationalities, regardless of anything we would divide one another with, we are by nature children of God. If we truly believe there is only one God, then we all share in that common bond with God in our humanity. And that should impact how we treat one another, how we see one another, how we relate to one another. And I believe that puts a real onus on us who are baptized and who have publicly claimed that identity to share that good news with the rest of the world. That we may see one another, not in our differences, but in our commonality. For in God we are flesh of our flesh and bone of our bones, each and every one of us, that we might live a new life, a new way of being together. Oh, what a story we need to tell to a world that needs to hear.